Get started. Good morning, everybody. I wanted to welcome you to the first webinar of our six-part community engagement series. And this one is titled The History of Treatment and Devaluation of People with Disabilities. These sessions all do build off of each other, but certainly are all standalone sessions and learning opportunities as well. We are thrilled to have Dr. Al Condeluci as our guide through this important work. But before we begin, let me introduce you to Al. Al has had a long and illustrious career as a leader in the disability community since the 1970s, and as some of you may have heard, has in the background been a secret musician at the same time. For many years, he was associated with CLASS, a full-service nonprofit organization providing services to people with disabilities. He has been an instructor with the University of Pittsburgh, both with the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences and the School of Social Work. He is the author of 7 books that have been used around the world, focusing on culture, community, social capital, and macro change. And last but not least, Al is a family member to someone who has a disability. Take it away, Al.
Great. Thank you, Sherry. It's really a pleasure and an honor to get on this voyage with Community Living Kingston District staff and friends and community members. This program that we put together, and we did this with Sherry and the leadership team there, is pretty ambitious. And as you'll come to see, we're really going to be doing 6 themes in these sessions, but the first 2, the one we're launching with today, which we'll get into in just a minute, and then the session we're going to be doing on October 16 are going to be large sessions with all of us. So we have about 120 folks that have signed up to participate in this program with us today. And I hope that we'll also have the same amount of people next time around. That would be on October 16, when we do the second of the series, right? And then the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th themes are going to be a little bit different. We really want them to be more interactive because they're going to be more content specific around strategies in supporting people. So those sessions, we're going to be smaller cohorts, and you'll be put into a cohort or be identified in a cohort, and we're going to be doing repeat sessions. I'll be doing repeat sessions with 4 different cohorts in those last 4 sessions, right? So it sounds a little confusing. It'll make sense as we move through. But we really wanted, we're using a Zoom, not a Zoom, but a Teams format, which is virtual. And there's a little bit that's missing when you do a virtual training. There's so much more that happens, obviously, when things are personal and face to face. I just got back from Oklahoma City, where I'm involved in a national project in the United States that is run in every state. And this past weekend was the Oklahoma program. So I was in Oklahoma City to do, and this was our first in-phase session that we did since the pandemic. And I got to tell you, gee, Manise, we've done these sessions, obviously, the last couple years using Zoom format. But being together was really so powerful, and so it adds a dimension. And we know that doing this program through the Teams format, it obviously makes it more convenient for everybody. Certainly most convenient for me to not be traveling up to Kingston, but also for you, where you can plug in from where you're at, either from your home or from your office or from a work site that you might be at. So the convenience level is just phenomenal with Teams or with Zoom as a format. But you lose a little bit of that interpersonal stuff where, you can look into people's eyes, you can see them. And there's, you can do interactive stuff a lot more, in a lot more focused way when you're face to face. But we're going to still do some interactive stuff in sessions 3, 4, 5, and 6. And we're going to, there'll be a little bit of homework. I'm going to ask you to prep a bit for them. And so hopefully all of it will make sense. And as Sherry said, each of these sessions do build on each other, right? However, they also stand alone. And what we mean by that is that if you happen to miss one of the sessions, um, the subsequent session that comes up, you'll be able to make sense of it and move forward. Now, obviously, we're recording these so that if you do miss a session for whatever reason, you can go back and take a look at that session in order to sort of understand the chronology of this voyage. And as Sherry indicated, the focus of this entire project is really to understand community and community engagement issues, macro issues, and during the course of the sessions that we go through, that'll start be fitting together for you. But maybe just in a general sense, before we launch into our topic for today, to frame a little bit of that by virtue of my own story. Since we're going to be on this voyage together from now all the way until March of 24, when we finish our last session. And so we're going to be, we're going to be getting to know, at least certainly you're going to be getting to know me a little bit better. So let me frame a little of that. Sherry was very generous in her introduction. But just simply stated, there's sort of three main frameworks that we're going to build this information from. And the very first one is in terms of my experience, the framework of being a provider, a professional, having the responsibility to provide certain interventions and services to people. As Sherry indicates, I've been at this for a while. I broke into the field in 1969 when I first got started working at a large institution. We're going to talk a little bit today about institutions, but in that path from 1969 to my retirement in 2019, I provided services, direct support to people. I was involved in, some planning stuff, some strategic, development issues. And the agency that I practiced at for most of my career was an agency very much like Community Living Kingston, a nonprofit organization that provides service and supports to folks with a whole variety of disabling, issues that got in their way. And so our organization did residential supports, and we did, skill building stuff, and we did, advocacy, and we did community engagement work, community change work. So that was the corpus of my professional involvement. Okay? So a lot of what we're going to talk about really is going to come from that leg of the stool, right? The three-legged stool. But the second leg that we're also going to focus in on is really comes more from an academic side of the equation, right? And what I mean by that is I believe that any practitioner, any person practicing as we are at whatever level, direct support, supervisory level, management level, leadership level, board member level. It doesn't matter wherever we're practicing from. Um, I really believe that practice should be anchored with viable theory, that we shouldn't just be shooting from the hip or just sort of, well, thinking, well, that sounds good, let's try that. I think it should be viable, academic and theoretical frameworks that really guide our work, right? And to that extent, I have experience as well, right? As Sherry said in the introduction, I'm on faculty at the University of Pittsburgh. That's where I got my degrees. I got my MSW, my master's in social work at the university, and then I got my doctorate in psychology from the University of Pittsburgh as well. My doctorate in 1984, my MSW in 1975, and um, and in those experiences, obviously, which are much more kind of scholarly and analytic in nature, I was exposed to theory and frameworks that should guide theory, right? That should guide action. Um, but my work at the university was also included teaching, right? I taught all the while I was still working at my organization, Community Living and Support Services. The acronym was CLASS. And But I was also on faculty, and I was teaching 2 or 3 courses every semester, and I was teaching both undergraduate and graduate level classes. And then, I had also responsibility academically for, doctoral students. And I sat on a number of doctoral dissertation committees for students that were focusing in on issues that I could be of help with from my own experience base. So academically, I've really been hungry for for newest understandings, if you will, of things in our field. And so, being on faculty, I have access, of course, to articles and journals, and also the opportunity to do research. And I'll talk a little bit about during the course of our experience with this program. I'll talk a little bit about some of the actual specific um, research that I've done, and actually some of that research in Canada as well. So that academic piece of the puzzle is, is obviously the second leg of the three-leg stool, right? But the third leg that I really want to underscore is as a family member. And Sherry indicated um, that I have this piece of personal experience in my background, and actually, it's for me the most guiding part of my work. I grew up and still live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and live up on a hill with a lot of my family members. And in fact, when I was born and growing up as a kid, that was the only people who lived up on our hill were family members. And so it was really truly a unique experience, right? To grow up in an extended family where everybody that you encounter loves you, right? And cares about you and wants to see you succeed and do well, and is in your corner, is supporting you, right? I mean, growing up with that kind of embrace is phenomenal. And as I was growing up, my best buddy was my cousin Carrie, who I'll talk a lot about because Carrie had Down syndrome. and we were the same age, born just a couple months apart. So um, our own experiences, both in the family as well as in our community, as we were growing up, were really seminal to my, to my entire paradigm about, how we should support the people to engage more in community. Um, but add on to that, not only my experience growing up with Carrie, um, but in the midst of all of this, my dad was diagnosed with Parkinson's, um, and his diagnosis was, happened when he was in his late 60s, right? And so it was toward the end of his life, but he lived, the about 15 years with the effects of Parkinson, and his situation got more complex. It was very aggressive, so it got more complex every year. And Dad needed actually, total support and care in his life, right? And of course, as a family member, as our dad, we provided that. So these three perspectives are going to be the key sort of pieces of the puzzle that I want to use as we go on this community engagement voyage together, right? Um, you know what is it like for families and individuals who are experiencing life through the lens of their disability, right? Um, and then, what is the best theory that we should use to provide the most appropriate supports that will make life better for people, right? Um, and then the third piece of the puzzle is, how do we render those supports? What interventions do we as providers bring to the table in assisting families as they, you know, as they search for inclusion and to be, just a natural part of their community. So, with that being said, I'm going to ask Sherry if we can get up our slides and get ready for our first part of the voyage. And here's the way we're going to do this, guys. Again, knowing some of the way we're contained because of the Teams format, um, and especially in these first two sessions, which are larger, right? We have a lot of people plugging in. Um, so what we're going to do is I'm going to go through some content with you with each of these first two sessions. And then as we're going through this content, if you have any questions or comments, or if something just doesn't gel for you, or maybe you're a bit confused by something I've said, um, that we're going to ask you to put that into the Q&A, right? Your question or your issue into the Q&A link. And you guys know how to use Teams. We went through 2-3 years of that was life, for all of us. So you just go to the Q&A link and type in either your question or your comment. And then we're going to have intervals here where we're going to pause and take some of those questions that you might have at various points in the flow of the content. And then lastly, when we finish up, we're going to set the tone for our next session, and then we're just going to open it up to general dialogue. And that's a little challenging, a little unwieldy. So you have on your masthead on your team's screen, a little hand, that shows that you have a question or you have something you want to add to to the dialogue. So we're going to ask you to use that, and then we'll be able to unmute you, or you can unmute yourself and then ask your question. Okay? So we'll try to make it as informal as we can in a formal virtual format. Okay? So with that in mind, we're gonna get started with some of our content, and this first session really is one that focuses in on a historic overview, and I think it's important that we start there, that we start with what has happened in disability and disability supports, and what are some of the historic traps that we're still in today that make community engagement that much more challenging for the men, women, and children with disabilities that our agency supports, and that are anxious to participate in community. Okay, so with that in mind, let's get started. We can advance the first slide, please, Sherry. So, this notion of disability is really, been a fascinating one to me. And as I mentioned, I kind of grew up with a cousin that had an intellectual disability, Down syndrome. Um, but, with a large family, there was, there was also, cousins, other cousins that I had, uncles, grandparents that had their own struggles, strokes, and other kinds of things that challenged them, right? So disability is sort of this very ranging kind of phenomena, and I want to sort of I want to shape it a bit for you with the next slide. So an overview of disability, and this is, I don't want to be oversimplifying this, as there's some complexity in disability for sure. But I want to try to put it in a more simple community-minded framework, right? There are three major manifestations that unfold with disability. Sometimes they're unique to that manifestation, and sometimes all three things get rolled into one with people, right? Just depends on the differing realities that people have. So the very first thing that we think of when we think about disability is physical disability, right? Wheelchairs and walkers, and things that are physically evident and very observable, right? And certainly physical disabilities exist, and there are various diagnoses or labels that have been identified to introduce the disability to community, right? And you guys know some of those diagnoses. We use them all the time, and I really believe that this is maybe the first mistake we make in terms of our intervention, because the minute somebody gets diagnosed, um, that's the very first step of disconnection from community when somebody gets diagnosed. But the very first notion of disability is a physical manifestation. So wheelchairs, walkers, dysfunction that somebody might experience in motion and movement. And I actually even add sight and hearing challenges in that rubric, because they do manifest in a physical way. If somebody loses their sight, they physically can't see, or they have difficulty seeing. Um, Same thing with auditory phenomena, where someone might not be able to hear or can't hear clearly and kind of struggle with that. I put those in the physical rubric. Um, the second major domain is cognitive manifestations. Now, cognitive manifestations, as you guys know from your work at Community Living Kingston, and if there are some community members that are plugged in, cognitive manifestations are information processing challenges. And, and those information processing challenges can be intellectually affected. Like my cousin Carrie was not able to really understand really abstract things, right? Most of what she could understand were concrete sort of things that
Okay.
were framed in a way that really helped her understand the issue. But not just intellectually, there's also, um, the information processing struggles that we sometimes see that unfold with traumatic brain injury, that unfold with stroke, that unfold with other types of disabilities where information processing gets affected, right? My dad had Parkinson's, and he also had some, cognitive stuff that started to play out, information that he just either didn't understand or wasn't sequenced in a way that he could digest. Folks with traumatic brain injuries, very in many classic ways, have difficulty with sequencing of tasks or understanding kind of a logical flow of information, right? And that's a manifestation that was brought on by their traumatic brain injury, right? The third major rubric is one that we also harder to see, and for many of us, we struggle to try to understand it. And that's emotional challenges, behavioral challenges, behavioral health issues. So, folks that really struggle with bipolar issues or depression or anxiety, OCD, other kinds of things that affect somebody from a more of an emotional range, right? So these three manifestations: physical imposition, cognitive information, digestion and utilization, or emotional ability to cope and to deal with the stresses of life, right? Those are the three major rubrics. Now, some of those disabling situations are observable. We call those overt. So if something is overt, you can see it. It slaps you right in the face. For many of us who work in the field, if you stop and think about when you first came to work at Community Living Kingston, your very first day, and I know we have some veterans out there who've been there 20, 30 years at the agency. But if you can go back in your mind and remember that very first experience when you walked in, and you walked in cold, right? For many of us, we don't have a lot of community experience with disabilities. And the reason for that is I'm going to go over from a historical perspective in just a minute. But when you first walked into Community Living Kingston, and then you walked into a day room and there was 25 people in wheelchairs, your first reaction was like, whoa, like, wow, you never saw that kind of, that many people at one place at one time that have a disability, right? It was almost like overwhelming. I know for me, one of my very first experiences that was so illustrative for me was when I was in college as an undergraduate. And I was taking a disability awareness course. And I was like a sophomore in college. I was a kid, and my experience with disability was with my cousin Carrie and my uncle Pete, who had a stroke. But I mean, I really wasn't around. I mean, there weren't kids with disabilities in school that I ever saw in high school and in grade school when I was a kid. And probably for most of us on the call, that's that's a truism, right? And I'm going to explain to you, why that happened. But be that as it may, I remember I was struggling with this course, and I asked my professor if if there was anything he could recommend to help me get a better grasp of disability. And so he said, well, I'm on the board of directors of an organization in town that it's an educational institution, and we educate kids. Now, kids with disabilities, by the way, in the United States of America and Canada, back in the '60s when I was in college, um, they didn't schools didn't have to public schools didn't have to educate kids with disabilities, um, and so there were a lot of private schools that were just for people with disabilities. And my professor was on the board of one of these schools. So he said, we always are looking for volunteers. And so maybe if you want to volunteer, I can set it up for you to meet the principal. And then you could have, you could do some volunteer work, and that will help you in your studies. And I thought, well, this is pretty good. I'll kiss up to the professor. He's on the board of directors. So I'll take this volunteer gig. So so I went to the school and I showed up, and the principal took me. She said, hey, you're a guy and we can always use male volunteers. She said, we have our teenage class where we have most of our teenagers, and we always are looking for help there. So let me take you down and introduce you to our faculty member and see if he could use you. So she takes me down, and we walk into this classroom, and there were maybe 30 kids, all with significant disabilities. I mean, I had never seen something like this before in such a mass, right? Um, but the disability that really confronted me was hydrocephalus. Now, hydrocephalus is we don't see much of it today because we've come up with medical procedures to shunt children, young children who are at risk of hydrocephalus. And hydrocephalus is essentially fluid on the brain that pushes the cranium out. And especially if kids are at risk of hydrocephalus as babies, when the brain is still and the skull is still forming, hydrocephalus actually pushes the skull out, and it makes the person's head huge, right? Now, we don't see much of this anymore. And in fact, if you just want to encounter hydrocephalus, go Google the term and take a look at some of the images, right? But it was very confronting to me because I had never seen something like this before. And so this classroom had 3 or 4 kids whose heads were huge, right? And I, it just I I wasn't even sure I could continue on as a volunteer because it was so face slapping to me, right? So disability that's physical in nature that you can see is very overt. And the first time someone encounters it, somebody in the community, their first reaction is to back away, right? Say, whoa. And to really see it as weird, see it as the person, that's all they see with the person, right? So this kind of this barrier, if you will, happens with overt situations, right? But it also happens with covert situations. A covert situation is when somebody's disability is not observable. So somebody that has a cognitive issue or maybe an emotional issue, and you can't see it, um, when they walk into a room, they just look typical, and your reaction is, it's just somebody else, just another guy or another gal. And then they start perhaps behaving a little differently, and that becomes face slapping to you, especially if you don't know the person has a disability. Now, one other overview issue, just I think that's important for us to know and to build in to our interventions is that the onset of the disability, and that plays a really important role. Number one, the onset is an issue of when the disability occurred, right? When did it start? So for some people with congenital disabilities, that onset happens at birth or shortly after birth. Like my cousin Carrie, they knew when she was born that she had, Down syndrome. In fact, at that time, this was in 1948 when Carrie and I were born, and they didn't call it Down syndrome then. They called it mongoloidism. That was the term used because her facial features, she had puffy cheeks and her high cheekbones, and her facial features looked like somebody who came from Mongolia. And so the doctors actually labeled her at birth as mongoloid, right? And that was the term that was used. We'll talk more about labeling in a moment, but um, congenital disabilities are ones that occur right off the bat. And the person grows up with the disability and they grow up with all the feedback. And oftentimes that feedback is negative um, to them and about them as people, right? Now, on the other side of this onset issue are people who acquire a disability, like my dad, right? My dad grew up typically, and worked and did everything that would typical that you might have done or I might do. And then his disability was imposed on him. Um, some people have accidents and injuries, cancer, stroke, a whole myriad of things that can occur in life, right? That affect then either physical, cognitive, or emotional manifestations, right? And sometimes those acquired disabilities are permanent, and sometimes they're temporary. Like I'm sure out of the 120 people we have on the call, people have broken legs or broken arms or strained this or sprained that, and was in a cast for a period of time, had to use a wheelchair or maybe crutches for a period of time. Those temporary situations, right? But other folks experiencing acquired disabilities um, can be permanent, right? Next slide, please. Now, when we think about disability and we begin to count how many people with disabilities are there in our country, in our city, in our community, right? And this is a little bit, this data is interestingly foggy, and it's foggy for a reason, right? In America, in the United States, our 2020 census estimates between 60 to 80 million Americans. That's out of a 340 million base. 340 million Americans, 60 to 80 right now at any given time have a disability. Now, the reason why there's a large spread between 60 and 80, I mean, that's a lot of people. So why can't we be more precise? And actually, the reason why we can't be precise when we start to count disability is that covert disabilities may not disclose. Somebody who has a disability that you can't see may not share that they have that disability. In fact, a lot of people don't want to tell folks they have a disability because they know if they do, they run the risk of being stereotyped and stigmatized and devalued, right? So, so a lot of people will not disclose. Um, but out of this 60 to 80, if we just take the middle number in the United States of America, 70 million, that would net out to be 1 in 5. So in reality, every fifth person that you bump into in Pittsburgh should have a disability if people are engaged in the community and involved in the community in a typical way. But I would challenge any of us to actually observe our communities and get a sense of how many people do we see out there with disabilities. It's very minimized in terms of the numbers. Now in Canada, Canadian statistics from 2017 found 6.2 million Canadians with a disability. That was the statistic used. That goes back to 2017. It was like 1 out of 10 folks have of working age have a disability. The World Health Organization estimates that 1.1 billion people on the planet have disabilities, right? And many people feel that that's a low estimate, that it's actually higher than that. But here's the final piece of the puzzle from a numbers perspective, and that is, at the end of the day, every one of us on this call are going to personally experience a disability at some point in our life, right? And if we live long enough, we'll have multiple disabilities to contend with, right? Because disability is within the natural course of life. It comes, it goes, it's there, it's not there. We personally experience it. Somebody you love is going to experience a disability. Somebody you love already has probably experienced a disability. So disability is very it is very generic, right? It is not aberrant. It is not special. It is not separate. It is not something that's unique. It's something that is commonplace in the world and in society and in every family in Canada, your family and my family as well. So and I underscore it. I'm trying to underscore this point primarily because what's happened in intervention and in service delivery is that we think disability is unique and special and separate. And we've created special and separate programs and services and agencies to deal with it, when in fact it is just a natural part of life. And so as we go on this voyage related to community engagement, we're going to really begin to say, how do we create a community where everybody belongs and participates, and disability ain't no big thing. It's no big deal, right? It's just a part of life. So next slide, please. Now, historically, because we have seen disability as something negative or something that is bad, historic roles have been framed for people who experience disabilities. And this goes back to the beginning of recorded time, where literally we began to try to identify the disability, and these historic roles have been cast onto people who experience disabilities, physical, cognitive, or emotional, right? And if you look at this list, and some of you guys, by the way, are familiar with social role valorization and the work of Wolfensberger and many of his associates. This list should be familiar to you if you've been exposed to social role valorization. But these aren't in any order of either importance or typical. But the very first role is as a deviant. And from a negative interpretation, by the word deviant is not necessarily bad. When you use the word semantically, it just means different, right? That's what deviant means. However, the word deviant in a common lexicon means bad. If somebody's deviant, that's scary, right? And folks back away. But historically, people with disabilities have been seen as something to dread, that their condition might affect you. You might catch it. I mean, even subtly, you guys know. I mean, I with my dad or my cousin or with the thousands of people with disabilities that I've been friends with over my experience base. That you go onto an elevator, you're with somebody that's using a wheelchair, or that they have some other overt situation happening. Maybe they're flapping, or they're rocking, or they're doing something that seems different than most people on that elevator have experienced. Their first reaction is to back away. They move closer to the wall. They want to get away from you and them. They're not sure what the hell this is, and are they going to catch it? Is something bad going to happen with this person in their behavior? I mean, that's just almost a knee-jerk reaction that we still see today, in so many ways, subtle and not so subtle. People with disabilities have been perceived as being menaces in society. A lot of historic roles in the literature, Brother Grimm fairy tales, and who the bad guys were always folks with disabilities. Captain Hook, right? And Peter Pan, and this kind of stuff embedded so deeply in the psyche of community, right? Subhumanization. I mean, even some of the terms that you hear, refer to somebody as a vegetable, right? They're somebody that's very significantly impaired. That they say when they're a vegetable now. They've had this brain damage in a car accident. I mean, just even terms that are subhuman, that literally separate that person out from everybody else as being less than, right? Object of pity, permanent child. I mean, how many of you guys, when you've gone out to dinner or lunch with somebody you're supporting, and the waitress, the waiter, comes over, and it's almost like they pat him on the, oh, it's so nice you're here, and then they ask you, what would they like to eat? What do they have? I mean, that notion of being a permanent child. This happens with folks with Down syndrome in dramatic ways today. We see it that create, just like the person who has Down syndrome as a kid the rest of their life. And the things we do, the programs we put together sometimes bait that, right? Or a burden to society that people, the general public, might feel, oh man, we have to pay taxes to take care of those people, right? So you get a lot of this community ripples that are out there that have a deep-seated effect on our goals in our work, right? We want to try to get people included and involved, and we have a lot of this stuff that's out there. Next slide, please. Now, these deep-seated roles, really, they lead to publicly accepted stereotypes and attitudes. I mean, you see Special Olympics situation where you have folks competing in some race, and at the end they give them a balloon, and oh wow, man, this is great, congratulations, and the public sees that and think, whoa, that's just the way we should react and treat people. So those publicly accepted stereotypes and attitudes are the biggest barrier to community engagement, to typical community engagement. And these publicly accepted stereotypes and attitudes, we're going to talk about in the course of this voyage that we're on. We're going to talk about what do we do to try to reset and nudge people in the community to begin to think differently, right? And this systemic devaluation is so deeply rooted. It's really hard to erase. And sometimes we actually get sucked into it ourselves. So so just being aware of that, being alert of that is really critical. Next slide, please. The images that we sometimes see just on the street that basically underscore some of these publicly accepted attitudes and stereotypes. Next slide, please. So now let me just frame a historical perspective on disability. And again, this is just all in the matter of understanding our current culture, understanding the current reality that we confront when we're trying to assist an individual or a family to become more included and to live an everyday life and to get a job and a house and a ride and friendships, right? um, this historical perspective goes back to the beginning, you know, period of recorded time. Um, and there's evidence throughout society, throughout the march of civilization, that underscore these these eras. And the very first one is the fact that people with disabilities, or the assumption that's portrayed, that people with disabilities are morally inferior, that they've done something wrong, God got mad at them and they're being punished. Their families are being punished. They did something wrong. They made God angry. They sinned. Right? Now, this notion of God afflicting people that God doesn't like or you know, doesn't care about bodes it bodes contrary to every theological interpretation of God, right? I mean, the theological interpretation of God is that if you believe in God, or if you've ever even thought about it, is that God is loving and caring and all embracing everybody, right? However, over time, the interpretation of God has really been manipulated, sometimes for nefarious reasons, but been manipulated even just because of intellectual struggles to understand the concept of God. And that notion is that somehow, some way, God can be mean and can actually punish you, right? I mean, Rabbi Harold Kushner in 1981 wrote a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. It was a monster bestseller. And Kushner, who's a Jewish rabbi, wrote that book from his own personal experience with his son, Aaron. When his son Aaron was born, he was born with progeria, a congenital situation that affects the metabolic processes of the body. And children with progeria basically die in their teenage years from old age, right? That the metabolic structure is out of control. It's racing out of control, and consequently, kids with progeria age quickly and die from old age. Right? Now, when they got the diagnosis, Rabbi Kushner and his wife got the diagnosis that their son Aaron had progeria. Rabbi Kushner's first reaction was, God, why are you doing this? Have we done something wrong? Were we bad? Right? And and as he prayed about that and thought about that, he said, well, wait a second. We sin. Everybody sins, but I'm no worse than anybody else. So why did this happen? Right? And then he goes to a second thesis in his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And he says, maybe God is bad. Maybe God is mean. But he couldn't get himself to accept that, right? That in his theology, that God is not bad or mean. So why did this happen, right? And he writes so eloquently as he comes to his third thesis in his book, and that is, it's the thesis that we just talked about a minute ago, that disability is within the natural course of the human endeavor. This is not about God being mad at somebody or God being bad. It's it's just this happens. This is life. It's just life 101. But this moral interpretation is still with us today. I had a family that I met with right before I retired. This was just a couple years ago, and I was this family came and they wanted to see our agency and what we do, and their son had a traumatic brain injury from an automobile accident, and so they wanted to see our programs, and so we were sitting in this meeting, and the mother said to me, she said, Al, I told Jimmy, her son, he was right there. He was sitting there. You haven't used a wheelchair. She said, I told Jimmy that if he wouldn't stop drinking and driving, God was going to get him back. But no, he didn't listen. He was drinking. He was driving. He doing drugs. And look at him now, she said. God got him back. God punished him. And I mean, this is right, sitting in my office, hearing a family member say something like that. But that moral interpretation is powerful. And it's still with us today. It's still that little thread, even though intellectually we can do like Rabbi Kushner did and come to some, place where we recognize that disability is natural. So you have that moral affliction. Then you have the productivity impact, right? That we live in countries in Canada and the United States that are highly competitive countries and highly capitalistic, certainly in the United States, heavily capitalistic, where the notion is if you can't produce, then you're really not that valuable to us. We want people who can produce. And and if you can't produce, then we're going to have to subsidize you, right? So that's a double whammy, right? So this productivity imperative is powerful. Now, in the United States, that a huge proportion, 60 to 75% of work-aged folks with disabilities are unemployed. And then employment is a challenge. You guys know that. You deal with it every day. And so this notion that somehow, some way, if people can't produce, even though they want to, then they're devalued even more. I mean, think about this. When you meet somebody new for the first time at a party or at a gathering, after you say hello and you go through some introductory pleasantries, the next question you ask people is, what do you do? Right? What do you do? I mean, it's the second question of life. What do you do? And if you happen to not be employed, you can't answer that question in an affirmative way. And the person that's asking you the question begins to say, "Oh, well, that's great. Yeah, okay, good, nice to meet you," and they walk away, right? Because your value is affected by productivity, and especially in our countries. Um, and so, what happens if society begins to struggle with this moral and productivity agenda? What do you do with somebody who doesn't have a disability, that can't work, or you're not sure, maybe God's mad at them, maybe they did something to get God mad? Well, we institutionalize them. That's what we do. And institutions happened starting back really in, if you do your historical review, back in the 1300s, we saw the very first institution established for people with disabilities. And it was established by religious orders, basically trying to take care of people. And then those institutions, they grew, they got bigger and bigger as people got put away. And I'm going to show you in Canada the evidence of that. in just a minute. But people get put away, and then medicalization moves in, and we think maybe we can fix them, maybe we can help them with their struggle. And so medicine begins to try to fix disabilities. And what happened there with institutions is they shifted from these asylums to hospitals. They became more sanitized by calling themselves hospitals, but they were still just warehouses, right? And then in the finally, as a society, we started to wake up to this brutality, and we started to deinstitutionalize. That started in the late 60s, early 70s, to begin to get people out of these gothic warehouses. I'm going to show you some pictures in just a minute. And now here we are with the challenge of social inclusion, right? How do we get people back into community in everyday lives to build relationships and friendships and social capital? Okay? So let's have our next slide, please. This notion of devaluation undergirds all of this, right? And each of these historical eras that I just showed you were embraced by societies, right? And the most profound thing, I think, was institutions, right? They became basically warehouses where people were dumped, were just left, um, basically left to die. Um, and then we began to expose these settings. So let me show you just in a quick summary format this phenomena of institutionalization. Next slide, please. In Ontario, the very first institution that was developed was in 1876. It was called the Orillia Asylum for Idiots. That was the actual name of the facility. It opened in 1876. Right? By 1890, there were 309 residents at Orillia. By 1902, population reached 652 residents that were basically, relegated to live there. By 1934, it moved up to 1,900 residents, and in 1961, it had 2,800 residents. In 1970, there were 20 institutions throughout Ontario that housed close to 10,000 or more than 10,000 men, women, and children with disabilities. Right? It wasn't until 2009 that institutions in Canada were ordered closed. Right? Now, this you just got to appreciate the raging, energy to put people away, to institutionalize them by society, by community, right? And this understanding this history is not to say that everyday people in community are bad. It's just to say that's sort of where their heads at. That the community is not for people with disabilities. There's their own place for them. Look at this next slide, please. Next slide, please. In Canada, in 1970, throughout the provinces in Canada, here were the number of institutions and residents that actually lived there. This is 1970 data. So, in Ontario, we had 20 institutions, 70 to 100 people, right? Now, if remember, the high water mark was 10,000 plus, right? So all these institutions throughout the entire provinces were, created a mental model that people were better off somewhere else. Next slide. So here's Arilla. Well, look how wonderful that looks, huh? Man, oh man, like haunted house on the hill. Just all these, these pinnacles, and I mean, just this awful looking kind of place for people. Next slide, please. Here's Rideau Regional Center. Same kind of look, right? Next slide. This is an institution. This is another institution in the United States. Again, similar kind of look with those peaks and those little pinnacles and dormers. Next slide. And once we began to go into these institutions, once community members went in, the stuff they saw was horrific. Actually, the most one of the very first prominent exposés on the horrors of these institutions happened in the United States at an institution. I'm going to show you a picture of it in a minute. It's in New York City, and Willowbrook had thousands of residents, and some of the physicians and some of the staff, they were just so overwhelmed that they said this is just not right. This is in the early 60s, and so they started to leak some of the horrors. Geraldo Rivera, the reporter Geraldo Rivera, was tipped off about Willowbrook and was invited to come to Willowbrook and take a look at it. So when he went to Willowbrook, the administrators took him. They took him to sanitized parts of the facility, but it was so overwhelming to him that he said, "Man, this has to be worse than it looks." I mean, it was bad, but he said it has to be worse. So he and a cameraman snuck in to Willowbrook one evening, and they videotaped unbelievable horrors, and of people being hosed, and just hundreds of beds in these large rooms. And I'm going to show you some of the other pictures, and some of these are sanitized versions. Here's a guy actually tied to a crib, and that happened a lot, so that they restrained the residents because they just didn't have enough staff. And the residents would get up and they'd roam around, so they tied them to the crib. I actually saw this in an institution here in Western Pennsylvania called Polk State School and Hospital. They had cages. They would put residents who were, who roamed. They put them in these cages. They were like, I just could not believe it. Next slide, please. So people were herded together. They were dressed alike. There was, no individuality. I mean, it was just essentially they were inmates in the asylum. Next slide. And all of these places became like little towns in and of themselves, and they made the residents work. They didn't pay them. It was like a peonage system. The residents had to work. This is a picture in a laundry facility in a facility in Philadelphia called Penhurst. That was also just, I mean, there was an exposure of it very similar to Willowbrook. Next slide, please. People were neglected and abused. There was no programming, no services. There was nothing for people to do. The smell of feces and urine were omnipresent. That there were hundreds of beds in large rooms. And when they would clean the room, they would hose the room down. I mean, it was just unbelievable that human beings would be treated like this. Next slide, please. And these places became legitimized by making them hospitals, right? But this was negative in two ways, right? One is that it shared with the folks in the community that they were they were in need of treatment. They were sick, and this sick role became a primary mental perception of disability. And people with disabilities still carry it. The medical model and the sick role model still permeate in the work that we do. Next slide, please. This is Willowbrook State Hospital in New York City. Next slide, please. This is Pennhurst. This is in Philadelphia. Now, what happened? There was a court order to close Pennhurst, and this happened in the 70s, in the late 70s. And when Pennhurst was ultimately closed and they moved all the residents out, they had this facility. They didn't know what to do with it. So let me show you the next slide. They turned it into a haunted attraction, right? I mean, some entrepreneur bought it and turned it into like this break house, where you go in and they scare you and you walk through it, and it's, at Halloween time, this becomes a huge attraction. This is where human beings lived, and many people died. Countless people died and were unknown in our society. Next slide, please. So in the 70s, we began to close some of these facilities. Some of them were done by court orders. Some were done, through the legal process. But all these efforts were vigorously fought by governments and unions representing people who work there, and many families were told this was the best place for their sons and daughters. And so now here it's exposed that these people were being abused and neglected. And the families felt guilty and felt terrible. They just, so they fought this deinstitutionalization. And the argument was that it was safer for the person and safer for general society when people were put away. And we still now see some of that happening, guys. I mean, as a backlash, for example, we're seeing a lot of advocacy today. And some of this we're seeing in the autism community to want to create separate places where people could be safer, or where people could, be happy and thrive. And the message there is that when we did all this deinstitutionalization in the 70s, we never really changed community. We never really were able to address attitudes and perceptions in the community, right? And so the community still harbors some of this. This notion of people in the community today. People in the community today. I mean, people in the community today didn't create the Orillas or the Pennhursts or the Willowbrooks of the past. But in some ways, are responsible for, changing that up. It's, from a social movement point of view, it's almost like, stuff we took away from Indigenous people in Canada, and, the schools that were created, and families being ripped apart, and kids going to these special schools to be normalized, right? To be better prepared for an Anglo-driven society. You know, we're struggling with all that right now today. You go to the Human Rights Museum in in Winnipeg. I mean, these stories are just unbelievably face slapping. So next slide, please. Because institutionalization, guys, is really more than buildings. Institutionalization is a state of mind. It's a mental model. And as long as people believe that folks are better off with you than they are in the general community, then we have an institutional problem, right? And that the notion of what we do about this is really going to be the nature of this voyage, this community engagement voyage that we're going to be on. Because I just refuse to believe that this is just the way it's going to be. That I really believe we can shape and change societal attitudes, and that there are still a lot of societal attitudes that are still present in an institutional model out in the general public. I when I was preparing for this to share this information with you, I was going to put up a video clip, but rather I'm going to ask you to do some homework on your own. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see there was a very thought-provoking movie that came out in the 70s here in the United States, called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Right? And this was a film based on a book by Ken Kesey. And the book was about a facility in Oregon that was designed for people with emotional disabilities and some physical disabilities too. And the storyline is the character in the book and in the movie, the main character, his name is McMurphy. R. Patrick McMurphy is the name of the prime character in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And in the movie, that character was played by Jack Nicholson. And I don't want you to watch the whole movie. Obviously, some of you may have seen it. Certainly, I think most of you know about it. But what I'd like you to do is go to YouTube, and we do it, whenever you have a free moment. And I'd like you to, you search YouTube. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the pool scene. Right? There's one, and these are short 2-minute clips. In fact, I would think that it would be a good exercise to watch as many of these small little clips as you can, just for sensitization. But there's a scene in the movie when they're in the pool, the institutional pool. All the inmates are in there, and that the staff member that's watching the pool, says to the residents, you're with us until we decide when you should leave. That sort of notion of control. And that's what institutions are. Institutions create control over people. And even though we say we empower people, and even though we believe that we're about choice, sometimes the choices are limited, and sometimes we exert our power because it is all we know, or because it's easier, or maybe simpler. And I'm not trying to slap any wrists here. Okay, all I'm trying to do with this session is awaken us to how challenging community attitudes are, and how our agenda is really more about how can we help reshape or change community attitudes, because until those change, people will never be included. No matter what we do, no matter how hard we try, the stuff we do with the people we support will really not amount to a hill of beans in changing attitudes in the community unless we're intentional about it, unless we begin to really think about how do you promote macro change, right? How can the things we do in supporting the men, women, and children that Community Living Kingston is responsible to support, how can we do that in a way that begins to reshape attitudes, right? What will make that happen? And we'll get into that. We're going to get into that as we move forward with our voyage, our program here. So let me have the next slide, please. Yeah, this T-shirt, I thought really, I think this is really an interesting mantra for us. What are we making by virtue of what Community Living Kingston does? Are we making what people want, right? And do we really know what people want? Do people really think they can achieve parity in a community? Or do they just think, all I want is just to be safe? Get me a group home that's nice and safe. I don't want my son or daughter abused or in a situation where they're going to be abused. I really believe we're in the business of making things that lead way to inclusion. So we really want to think about making things that people want and that will literally actually lead to an inclusive community. Next slide, please. And so here's what we know, right? All people want all people want this. By the way, not just people with disabilities. All people want to be active to the level they choose to be active in the community. But they want that choice. They don't want community to dictate how active they are. They'd like to be able to dictate that. And they want to be productive, do something that matters, offer something, be treated with dignity, right? Every human being wants to be treated with dignity. This is a natural law of behavior. It's like the natural law of science is that if I'm holding this pen and if I drop it, it falls down, to the ground, right? If I hold this pen up and I drop it, right? And that's the natural law of gravity, right? The natural law of gravity. And that's the reason you don't jump out a window, is because you know the natural law of gravity, right? You know that if you jump out a window, you're going to splat. You're not going to be able to fly, right? So there's a natural law of behavior, right? That all people want to be treated with dignity. Nobody wants to be abused or neglected or put away, right? People want to stay in their home or community. They don't want to have to go somewhere in order to get what they want. And people need to be able to get around their community, that we're social animals and we're transient. We need other people. If the pandemic taught us anything, it taught us how terrible loneliness and isolation is, right? And not being able to be with people that we want to be with, not being able to go somewhere or do something that we want to do, right? And maintaining and retaining and building relationships. Right? So as we get ready to go on this voyage, that we're going to remember this list, And we're going to frame this voyage accordingly, right? And so in our next session, we're going to really zone in on the notion of isolation and loneliness. We're going to really look at what happens when people are isolated, what happens to them, and what does loneliness do to us. By the way, loneliness and isolation are toxic issues. They're more lethal than smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. They're lethal. They kill us, not just people with disabilities, any of us. So isolation and loneliness really become another important element for us to understand as we get prepared to make something that people want and to make something that matters, right? The programs and services that community living in Kingston has been doing traditionally, some of them are great. I'm not here to throw any rocks at them. I'm just to say, are they doing what people want? Are those programs truly creating inclusivity and parity in community? Right. Um, so our the first 2 sessions, this one on history, and then the next one on social isolation and loneliness, are going to kind of set the tone. And then the following 4 sessions are really going to be building blocks to a more inclusive community where we can go from a micro interpretation to a macro activity pattern and really begin to get closer to things that really matter in that challenge. Right? Now, the sessions, as I mentioned when we started, the sessions that we're going to go through, sessions 3, 4, 5, and 6. Sessions 3 are going to start in late October and run through November. We're going to have 4 different cohorts. So they're going to be smaller because we're going to go into breakout rooms and I have some trigger questions. We're going to be examining some stuff. We're going to be thinking together about this. So in November, our theme is going to be understanding social capital and relationships and what we can do to really facilitate our relationships. We're going to take December off, holiday time, and we're going to get back into it in January. And that's our 4th session. We're going to have, again, four cohorts, and we're going to be focusing that session in January on community mapping. Right? What exists in Kingston right now that are places and spaces where inclusion and engagement can actually happen. Right? We're going to have some tools. I'm going to have some forms that we're going to think about using. We're going to do a little bit of exercises prior to the next session, where we're going to ask you to do a little bit of mapping of your own community and then bring that back. Because session 5, which happens in February, is going to focus on the social infrastructure of the community settings that you identify in the mapping process. And we're going to talk a little bit about understanding social infrastructure, rituals, patterns, activities, expectations that happen in community settings that we need to be aware of in an effort to coach and to facilitate people that we support truly intersecting with those communities in meaningful ways that fit in. And then our last session will be in the month of March. It's our 6th session. And we'll really be focusing in on macro change. And we're going to be looking at the role gatekeepers play and how we can facilitate a fading of anything we're doing so that the community can begin to absorb those support activities. So let me see if we can let me have the next slide, please. We're going to do all of this with as much conversation as we can. And this quote from Margaret Wheatley really sets us up for the Q&A, and for any questions that you might have, because human conversation is really the most historical and in a way the easiest way to cultivate conditions for change. And if we can sit together and talk about what's important to us, we begin to come alive, and we also begin to find the solutions that will create this community where everybody belongs. Next slide, please. Because it's not just our differences that divide us, guys. It's really the judgments and the assumptions we make about the different things we see around us that really affect what divides us and not. You know, the assumptions we make. We see something we're not aware of or not familiar with. We immediately can polarize that difference, and we can also devalue it, make fun of it, shake our heads, roll our eyes at something that's different from us. Right? So those judgments are really the fodder of exclusion. They're the fodder of separation, right? Those conclusions we make about that which we don't know. And so we're going to examine that as a sociological process. We're also going to look at things like, the challenge of social change, and we're gonna really try to understand that through social influence theory. How can people be influenced in their thinking by peers who do get it? Right? So we're going to be using some very understood theoretical framework to try to capture some of this. Next slide, please. Robert Putnam, and we'll get into Putnam, especially in the week we do the social capital notion. But Putnam said, if you belong to no community and you decide to join one, you cut your risk of dying in half over the next year. Statistically, that joining things breed life, and separating people out breeds death. I mean, it's just as simple as that from a sociological perspective. And Putnam's on faculty at Harvard. He's probably been one of the most prolific researchers on the impact of social capital. And so we'll examine some of Putnam's stuff. In fact, the sessions that we look at social capital, I'm going to introduce you to a social capital benchmarking survey that Putnam and his associates at Harvard developed, and really suggest you use it as a tool. And your homework that session is actually going to be to conduct a couple interviews with folks that you support using the social capital benchmarking survey. So we're going to talk more about Putnam a little bit down the path. Next slide, please. Sir Francis Drake. I love this quote, right? Sir Francis Drake said, there must be a beginning to any great matter, but continuing until the end, until it be thoroughly finished, that really yields the true glory. And so when you think about us and our role, no matter what your job is, DSP, manager, supervisor, friend, wherever family member, the beginning to this great matter was getting people into the community, okay? Getting them out of these programs and into community experiences. But just being in the community isn't enough, right? The only way you truly are included is when you belong to that community, that you are not only in the community, you're of the community. Right? That's a process. And the same is true with us at Community Living Kingston, right? We're on a great journey here. We've really been working for 70 years to try to get people included in the community. We that's been our goal since our founding 70 years ago, is to get people engaged in the community. That's what we're about, right? And yet here it is 70 years later, and many people are just not engaged. Some people are. That's great, and we celebrate that. But most of the people that you encounter every day are still not really engaged in the community. So that's our challenge, and that's really where the true glory is as we begin to get closer to that which we were founded from 70 years ago. Next slide, please. So let me finish with this little parable, and then we'll open it up to any questions that folks might have that are either in the chat room or in the Q&A, or you might spontaneously have. Okay. I love this little parable, by the way. It was I found this in a book by Margaret Wheatley. Margaret Wheatley wrote a book called Conversations Can Change the World. That's a great little book that really truly gets to that quote I showed you from Margaret Wheatley. But in this book, I found this parable called an Aztec story. And it really spoke to me, right, about this notion of change, social change. So it goes like this. A long time ago, there was a fire in the forest that covered our earth. People and animals started to run, trying to escape from the fire. Our brother Owl, Tocatl, was running away also when he noticed a small bird hurrying back and forth to the nearest river and the fire. He headed toward this small bird. Next slide. He noticed that it was our brother, the Quetzal bird, running to the river, picking up small drops of water in his beak, returning to the fire and throwing that tiny bit of water on the flame. The owl approached the Quetzal bird. He said, "Brother, what are you doing, man? Are you crazy? You're not going to achieve anything with just a little bit of, a little splash of water from your beak. You must run for your life. You got to get out of here. You're not going to do anything." The Quetzal bird stopped for a moment. He looked at the owl, and then he answered, "I'm doing the best I can with what I have to save a place I love." It is remembered by our grandparents that a long time ago, the forests that covered our earth were saved from a great fire by a small little Quetzal bird and an owl and many other animals and people who got together to put out the flame. Right? This is such a beautiful little parable of synergy. It's a parable of modeling. It's a parable of social influence theory. It's about the fact that people in communities see other people doing the right thing and wanting to do that too, right? And so as we go down this path of community engagement, we're going to be thinking about, the Quetzal bird. And the Quetzal bird wasn't able to put the whole fire out by himself, obviously. Just like none of each of us are going to be able to change community by ourselves, right? But if each of us do a little bit, if each of us do our part, whatever we can, and each of us do them rowing in the same direction, um, then we're gonna make some. The sea change is going to happen, and we're going to make some impact on our community, and we're going to create the start point for a community where everybody belongs. So let's do this. Let me next slide, please. By the way, this last slide that I have up here. Oh, this is Gandhi. Yeah, yeah. I mean, go without saying. Next slide. Here, I'm going to put up some information on me. You're going to have access to this all the while, but you're also going to have access to me during this entire voyage. And as we start doing things that are really more tangible and more action oriented, um, I want to be available to you um, as you try this, as you try the stuff we're going to talk about. And if it doesn't work, or if it is working, or if part of it was working and this part didn't work, I want to help you process that through. So this is contact information on me, right? This is my phone number and this is my email address. So that as we start proceeding into things that are tangible for you, um, this is how you can get a hold of me if something doesn't work for you. We're going to be on this journey together until March and probably even after that. Um, and so, I want to be available to you. Also, you have my website there. It's just my name, alcondeluci.com. But on my website, I have some downloadable stuff for you to take a look at. There's videos on the website that you might find useful, and especially in terms of sharing some things with your colleagues, with family members, with people you're serving. So I'm going to invite you to take a look at what's there. Use whatever you can or whatever you think is going to be helpful, and contact me should you have any questions or comments. In the meantime, I know that been pretty this has been a kind of a downer, right? I mean, talking about what's happened to people over time can be oppressive, but we do it because we want to change it, right? We really want to create better outcomes. So I want to open it up now to you. Sherry is going to kind of put us all back into a matrix. We have 100 plus people on the call. So um, if if you have any questions or comments you want to make, we have a little bit of 15 minutes where we can engage. Um, know that if you don't have any comment, that's okay. I'm not trying to force people to, have to engage. I want you to digest what we talked about, think a little bit about it, maybe take a look at some of the stuff that I asked you to look at as it relates to institutions, and then we can begin. We're going to be doing a lot of engagement actually in our sessions 3, 4, 5, and 6. They're designed for that with the smaller cohorts. These first two, we're trying to just overview topics. So anything compelling? I don't know if
We
there's a chat room, Sherry.
we do have one question in the Q&A, and it
Yeah.
says, just curious. We talk about when institutions were closed here in Ontario, but what about in the States? Are they
Mm,
closed? If so, when and what year? What was it that they were
yeah.
shut down?
Yeah. Great question. Thank you. And it's an embarrassing answer for me because they are not closed in the United States, and in many places, there's even a movement to enhance them. So it's a sad commentary, but there's a lot of sad commentaries about the United States. And if you follow our politics, you probably see them on a daily basis. Um, there's a backlash happening in the United States that's very to me very troublesome. And that backlash is individualization and self-centeredness. And the notion that's happening in the United States is that people are really saying, hey, I don't want to have to, deal with you. This is more about me. That me first stuff, MAGA, that notion about, white privilege and all that stuff it's reeling its ugly head. And with disability supports, it's there as well. This is a backlash in the United States against. You just look at DeSantis' attack on Disney World because Disney had Gay Pride Day or whatever, and the efforts to try to suppress what people could read and what people should be choose to be exposed. All that stuff is sort of is whiplashing. So it's terrible. In my own state of Pennsylvania, there are still institutions that are open. In fact, when I finish this talk with you today, I'm getting in my car and I'm driving up to Central PA. I'm doing some staff training with an agency up there, much like Community Living Kingston. But I have to drive right past an institution called Ebensburg. It's right on the highway that I'm taking to go up to Towanda, and there's a big institution there that has not been closed. So Pennhurst is closed, yeah. Western Center has been closed, yeah, that's good. But Polk is still open, Ebensburg is still open. There's still state institutions in our own state that are open. So I'm embarrassed by that. I continue to advocate with my colleagues here in Pennsylvania and in the United States. But I am convinced that some of this has to impact general community attitudes. Because if general community attitudes aren't addressed, then we can slip right back into this notion of separating people. So thanks for that question. I'm just sort of hanging out that embarrassment right in front of you. Honestly, we still have a lot of work to do in the United States. We're trying. Advocates are out there doing their best, but we have a political backlash that we have to also make sure we change, and not change, but make sure that we suppress, this whole white supremacist separation, patriarchal, male-dominated, mentality that's happened in our culture. Other questions?
I see that Terry has her hand up. Terry, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just want to say that a few things that you said really resonate, just around that whole attitude and perceptions, that kind of thing. I know I was getting my hair done not too long ago and had a conversation with somebody, and it came up, that whole attitude that people need to be separated because my kid doesn't need to be impacted by the kids that need the more help. So those attitudes are alive and well and seem to be pervasive. But the piece that really because that can get you down
Yes,
hearing those kinds of comments. But the piece that you said, or the thing about the going over to get the water and bringing doing what we can and continuing to stay focused on that positive and banding together is really important, because otherwise it gets daunting, the amount of work that needs to get done.
Absolutely. What great points that you just made. And by the way, your hair looks nice. So I'm just okay. But clearly that's the whole reason to share with you that parable of the Quetzal bird, because clearly you can get so damn overwhelmed to saying, what can I do? How can I'm just one little pea in the pod here, and you got all this energy going this way. How can I do that? And that really begins to suggest of how we can build capacity in the community for the kinds of attitudinal shift about inclusivity and welcomeness. And so that a person in the hairdressing shop won't say, I'm worried that my kid's going to be shortchanged when that kid with a disability, learning disability, is in his class. That person will say, boy, I am really glad my child is able to be a part of all kids doing better in the class by working together around an issue. That's the kind of stuff that will get us to scream hooray, right? But in the meantime, we've just got to collaborate and cooperate and connect and to find allies wherever and however we can to promote inclusion and to really open eyes with people that this stuff is connected. Devaluation is connected. If I devalue one group of people, then it's pretty easy for me to devalue another group of people and a third group of people. I can get sucked into that. So, but equally, valorization is also something that is infectious. That if one group gets valorized, then maybe another group can get valorized. And if we can get this group of people out into the community, maybe we can also get folks with the more severe disabilities into the community. So it creates an energy. So I really, really appreciate the comments. Very, very insightful. Thanks. Anything else that we have? I know we're closing in. It's 5 till noon. The bargain is noon for you guys. I know everybody has lots of things that you got to do. Any final parting questions or comments that folks might have? Okay, well, hearing none, let me just thank Sherry and the leadership team at Community Living Kingston, the board of directors, for really, going on this journey. We're going to be looking at and examining this. It's a commitment over 6 months that and we've been working on this all, during the summer and putting the whole thing together. So I am just so honored to have a part of this and to be, even in a virtual sense, to be with you today. And our hope is that as we get through these sessions and as we put together some strategies and some intervention activities, that we can really begin to start that conversation of change. And I know one thing that Sherry and I and the team have talked about is the possibilities of maybe holding a World Cafe in the Kingston area that's open to the greater community, and that we really begin to invite in community members into the conversation of inclusivity, and that it not be just a conversation we have as an organization, but that we really engender a community-wide conversation on inclusivity and on welcomeness and ways that can happen. And the backdrop in Canada is really a positive one, in spite of some of the things that we talked about just a minute ago, where you can get the creeping devaluation. Canada has such a powerful sense of community and of social connection, so much greater than in the United States. And so I think there are possibilities out there that are just really waiting to happen. And I am so honored to be a part of that. So Sherry, let's wrap up. If anybody wants to contact me afterwards through an email or a phone call, please feel free to do that. If I don't get right back to you, know that I will. My schedule is a little bit complex as well, like yours, but I promise you I'll get back to you for sure. Okay.
Thank you, Al. Just a couple things before we end for the day. A couple of people asked about slides. I will be sending those out. And for anyone who wants to watch and rewatch today's session, I'm hoping to have it up on our YouTube channel later this week. so that you can also invite your peers and friends to view it as well. I just want to finish by thanking Al for a thought-provoking and, while difficult, a very good place to start our conversation over the next 6 months on this journey. I think, you know, the thing about our past is if we don't understand it, we're doomed to repeat it. So this context is incredibly important for the work ahead. So thank you, Al, and thank you everyone for hanging in today. And we'll be in touch soon.
Sherry, let me just add one final thing. I'll have slides and readings for our next session, which is on October the 16th. What day is that? Is that a Monday or a Tuesday?
It's a Monday as well, yes.
Monday at 10 o'clock in the morning. It's going to be on loneliness and social isolation. I will have 2 monographs that I'll be sending up to Sherry. She'll make sure you get it. If you could take a look at those monographs before we meet on the 16th at 10 o'clock, that would really be helpful, because that'll sort of put some things in perspective for you. And then we'll be able to go through the material. But we're going to be doing a deep dive into this notion of isolation and loneliness. Other than that, thank you very much. Thank you for your attention and your participation today. We'll see you guys on the 16th.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again.
Take care, Al.